Hello history fans and welcome back to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. It's Women's History Month, so each week I'll be doing a roundup of the week's worth of women I've been talking about. For those just listening to this episode, I'll play the short video that I've been posting on TikTok and Instagram, and then we'll expand a bit on the person's story. So if you're listening, don't forget to follow the podcast, and if you're watching, please do subscribe and leave a comment letting me know one of your favourite women from history. Shall we get into some history? It's day 4 of 31 days of women's history for Women's History Month, and today we're talking about Jane Austen. Jane was one of 7 siblings growing up in Hampshire with a supportive family who enjoyed making up their own stories through writing plays and acting them out together. She started writing in 1787 with poetry and dark comedies, and then in 1799 she began her first proper, serious novel, titled First Impressions, which would later go on to be her most beloved work, Pride and Prejudice. Her supportive father tried to get her works published in London, and it's not known if she was aware of this, but he was unsuccessful, and later when he retired in 1800, the whole family moved to Bath. Whilst there, she receives a marriage proposal in 1802, which she ultimately declines, and it's not known at the time what her reasoning was, but later she receives a letter from her niece in a similar situation, and Jane tells her not to marry if there's no affection there, which gives us an insight into Jane's mind, which can also be seen in all of her works. In 1811, her brother Henry is a banker, but also doubles as her literary agent, and successfully takes Sense and Sensibility to a London publisher. But of course, because of the time, her books were published anonymously, and it wasn't until after her death that her brother Henry announced that she was the writer, and went on to publish her final works, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. She has become a historian, or like a historical source for Regency England to modern readers, because her novels show the society and the culture of the time, vividly depicting the lives of those in the middle class through these classics that will always be loved. Also, look at these editions. Jane Austen was one of 7 siblings growing up in Hampshire with a supportive family who enjoyed making up their own stories through writing plays and then acting them out together. She was born on the 16th of December 1775, and she was the youngest of the siblings with just one sister, so she had a close relationship with her, but the closest bond she had was with her brother Henry and with her father. In 1783, Jane and her sister were sent to boarding school, and when returning home, her father supplied her with books and writing materials to encourage her passion for reading and writing and her creativity. She started writing in 1787 with poetry and dark comedies. Most of her stories and poems touched on topics that reflect the time, and eventually made up 3 whole notebooks. In 1789 she wrote Love and Friendship, a dark satirical comedy which began her thinking towards actually being a writer. She wrote her first, more serious work, titled First Impressions, in 1799, which would go on to become her most popular work, Pride and Prejudice. Her father attempted to get her works published in London, but then retired in 1800, and the family moved to Bath. She does receive a marriage proposal in 1802, but she decides against it, despite it being a very practical match. The reason for her saying no to the proposal wasn't known at the time, and was revealed later on in a letter to her niece, in answer to her niece who had asked her for advice on a similar situation. And Jane told her not to marry if there was no affection there, which gives us an insight into Jane's mind and her views, and it's also seen in her novels with her heroines. In 1811, her brother Henry is working in a bank, but he also is helping as her literary agent, approaching London publishers with Sense and Sensibility. After previous troubles getting other books published, it was a relief to have Sense and Sensibility published in that year, and by 1813 the first edition had sold out. It's then followed by Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, the most popular and successful at the time actually. But of course, because of the time, she published anonymously, and it wasn't until after she died that Henry announced her as the writer. So he had the last novels Persuasion and Northanger Abbey published, which means in 1816 her health had started to decline. If we rewind a bit, sorry. She tries to hide it and continues writing, but in April of 1817 she's confined to her bed, and by July that year she passes. So Persuasion and Northanger Abbey are the posthumously published works that Henry writes about the author before he reveals it to be Jane. I think it's in the beginning of those books. Like I said, she has become like a historian for Regency England for modern readers, as her novels show us the society and culture at the time. She vividly depicts the middle classes of the time through timeless classics that have always and will always be popular. She seems to embody the headstrong women who lead her novels, always looking for love that eluded the author herself. But perhaps it's the lived experiences that inspired her writing. After all, she did fall in love with Tom Lefroy in 1875, but the match was deemed unsuitable by their families, so she was never to love again. It sounds exactly like one of her novels. And with that, let's move on to the next Jane. It's day 5 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today I'm talking about the rivalry between Queen Jane and Queen Mary during the Tudor period, because I have just written an article about it in the latest edition of the Historians magazine, so please go and check out that edition if you'd like to read the full article. But for now, let's sum it up. Lady Jane Grey and Queen Mary I are constantly pitted against each other throughout history, but I do think it's time we reassess that whole situation, because they did not despise each other as the history books might like you to believe. Firstly, Jane's stereotype. She wasn't as weak as we all seem to think, because she didn't give in to the Duke of Northumberland's plan. He just wanted her to be queen so that his son, her husband, could have been king, but she refused to proclaim him king because the crown was hers. So she did stand up for herself when the time came to it, and when she was just thrown into the monarchy, she did her duty, she accepted it, and she made the best of it. Mary did have a claim to the throne, and she had the right to rally some people behind her and fight for it. Female characters throughout history are either vilified or glorified for being powerful. They can't just be a powerful woman because that's what they believed in and that was the right thing to do. They have to either be, oh my gosh, you are amazing, what a hero, or oh, pure evil, what a villain. And Mary is placed into the villain category. Yes, in the future, she is maybe worthy of that title, but at this moment in time, not. In a male-dominated court, both of these women showed that you can have power over your own decisions and actions. Besides, when Mary got power, she just placed Jane under arrest, and it was known to both of them that she wasn't actually ever going to execute her, but Jane's stupid father went and rebelled against Mary, so then she had to execute Jane because she was seen as part of the revolt. So really, it was the men messing it up once again. Okay, sorry, I did just say that to get all the trolls in the comments. It's Women's History Month though, so we are allowed that perspective, for this month at least. It's important that we uphold these reputations of these two queens fairly in history, and we don't just see them as a weak and timid Jane and a villainous evil Mary. It's never that black and white. I did write about this a lot more eloquently, I hope, in the magazine, so if you wanted a bit more of an in-depth, more well-explained version of my thoughts, please give the magazine a read, because I researched it properly, whereas I feel like here, I'm just rambling, but also because I don't want to give it away. Go and read the article. Thanks. As I said, I don't want to give away what I wrote completely in the article if you did actually want to go and read that. And I have done an entire episode on Lady Jane Grey before here on YouTube, so scroll back to see that, and we'll have a quick summary here. Jane is worthy of being recognised for her academic ability and strong spirit, and not just a tragic victim of women's history. She's an accomplished intellect who didn't give in to the men surrounding her, like Northumberland, who just wanted his son to be king. And I think she deserves her place in our list of monarchs, because the amount of monarch books you see, and it's just, she's not in there. Sadly, there's no portraits from the time that we know are definitely her, so we can't know for sure what she looked like. Even contemporary writing from the time doesn't really describe her either. And of course, the most famous portrait of her execution by Paul Delaroche from 1833 doesn't show us what she looked like either. So another mystery in her story. On the 10th of July, she arrives at the Tower of London ready for her proclamation, when she receives a letter from Mary saying she is not giving up her claim to the throne. So Jane issues a proclamation asking her people to rally behind her and support her claim. On the 18th of July, we have a letter written by Jane talking about her right to the throne that she signed Jane Queen. And later we have her signing for a delivery of jewels as Jane the Queen, but later Queen has been scrubbed out, so very quickly people made it clear that they didn't recognise her claim to the throne when Mary came to the fore. So maybe Jane's reign was doomed from the start, even though the previous King Edward, her cousin, had laid out her succession. The people wanted Mary. Even though Mary nearly left the country before thinking there was trouble, thinking she was in trouble, as there's reports of the imperial ambassador urging Mary to leave the country, thinking that the odds were against her and her situation was tenuous, so she should escape. But from the 10th of July, this changes and support for Mary grows instead. It's the ambassador that also suggests to Mary that it was all Northumberland's fault, and well, we know it was, but he had this big grand scheme to make his son king, for which Mary loathes him, so when she's queen, he is one to be punished by death. Anyway, Jane did have the more legitimate claim than Mary, as she was recognised by the council, but Edward's device that had named her queen wasn't pushed through Parliament, so legally she's not queen yet, but the council had agreed that she was, so that's where the frustration comes in. Jane is now staying in the Tower of London as a prisoner until the 13th of November 1553, which is when her trial was, that took place alongside her husband as well, Thomas Seymour. They were tried on the same day. Thomas Cranmer wrote her trial transcript in Latin, which tells us that she was just a teenage girl standing trial for treason, which is crazy. She walked the mile from the Tower to Guildhall and she pleaded guilty, meaning she became the youngest royal woman to be condemned for treason. Again, I am skipping over huge parts of this, go watch the longer video. But the trial was just a formality, and Mary showed her intentions of showing mercy, but of course her story now takes another big turn. Mary wanted to pardon Jane. Mary was Frances, Jane's mother's godmother, so Jane grew up visiting Mary, and they had a close relationship, but ultimately Mary was forced, without really having a choice, to execute Jane because of these things. She knew Jane was forced into the situation, but recognised that justice was needed to be shown. Henry Grey, Jane's father, the idiot, was a key conspirator in the Wyatt rebellion against Mary that took up arms against Mary's intended marriage to the King of Spain, King Philip II. King Philip II of Spain. Because of course he was a suspicious Catholic foreigner who just wanted to get England involved in his own wars. Now Mary has previously already shown him mercy, releasing him from prison after Jane's deposition. So he has no second chance. You know, he's already messed up. And even though Jane obviously wasn't involved, the imperial ambassador demands her execution because of her family's involvement in rebellions. So the decision of her execution comes as a huge shock, as Mary was just going to leave her be. Even though she was condemned, I think the plan was she was just going to stay in the Tower. Jane decides she's going to die a Protestant martyr, even though Mary tries to save her soul by trying to convince her to convert to Catholicism. So on the 8th of February 1554, Mary sends a Catholic chaplain to convert her, but Jane debates with him, and he's so impressed by her determined spirit that he agrees to go with her on the execution day. And then of course we come to the tragic tale of her execution that you can hear all about in the other video. Sorry, gotta be dumb. Okay. Moving on to a pirate tale. It's day 6 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are talking about Zheng Yi Sao, the most powerful pirate in history. She comes into our history books between 1775 and 1844. In her 20s, she's working in a floating brothel when it's bombarded by pirates, and the captain claims her as his own. But she will only marry him if he gives her half of her fleet, which he does. So they get married and she owns half of this pirate fleet. She has her own colours separate to her husband, so she runs the Red Flag fleet, which leads the ships. She's out in the front. They block trading ports, they defeat all oppositions, and even the British Navy won't take them on. When her husband dies, she takes over all of the fleet, making her the most successful pirate of the South China Seas, commanding what's estimated to be 60,000 men and 800 ships at that point in time. She controlled the trade routes of China. That's a massive, massive power to hold. And she beheads anyone who tries to steal her plunder or any husbands that are unfaithful. In 1806, the Qing dynasty sent an armada to try and destroy her pirate empire, but they failed and she sunk all 63 of their ships. The Qing emperor's last resort was to offer her a deal, so she kept her wealth and a few ships, and her most evil pirates were executed and the rest had to join the navy, so she retires and builds a successful gambling house before dying aged 69, which makes her arguably the most successful pirate to ever live. She had the biggest fleet, the most money, the most men, the longest career, and she died rather than being executed. But awfully, we don't know her actual name. Zheng Yi Sao apparently just means the wife of Zheng Yi, so what the hell was her real name? She's the most powerful pirate in history. We don't know her name, but her stories do give us a nice little change to the usual treatment of women on pirate ships. So the golden age of piracy was run by a woman. Zheng Yi Sao, the most successful pirate in history, enters in 1775 as Shi Yang and dies in 1844. At the height of her power, she commanded 12,000 ships, compared to the infamous Blackbeard, who only commanded one and captured like 30. So, in her 20s, she's in the brothel when she marries the pirate Zheng Yi in 1801, and she begins her pirate life. Her husband's pirate life was like a family affair, as his fleet was part of or under his cousin's fleet under the patronage of the Vietnamese Tay Song dynasty. But his cousin was captured and executed along with, I believe, the rest of the Vietnamese dynasty, so Zheng Yi took control. And by 1805, the pair had managed to unite all the local pirates into the Guangdong Confederation of Pirates, collecting about 70,000 men who had already been smuggling pirates. They were smuggling things, but now they had a leader. They created the confederation, so it's official now. Then her and her husband adopt a son, but he goes overboard and dies in 1807, so she quickly took control of leading the pirates. And later she then marries their adopted son, who would lead some of the ships and start introducing new laws and codes. Like her men could be killed for cowardice or beheaded for stealing loot, or if you had an unauthorised absence, your ear would be cut off. Unauthorised absence sounds very modern, doesn't it? If one of them didn't show up to a plundering, I suppose, is more accurate. Then they start attacking salt ships and introduced like a passport system that meant salt merchants had to buy safe passage past the pirates, which grew to every merchant and fishing boat eventually having to pay to safely go past pirates. So they had huge control over trading. By 1809, the Chinese government had to ask the British and Portuguese navy for help, but they were still unsuccessful in stopping the pirates. Eventually, by 1810, she apparently starts to kind of have enough anyway, and negotiations begin with the Chinese government, so that 17,318 pirates, 226 ships, 1,315 cannons, and 2,798 assorted weapons were officially surrendered. She took a good pension from the government and returned home to Guangdong, where she built a notorious gambling house, leaving her pirate life and legacy behind her. Next, on to my favourite era, the early Roman Empire. It's day 7 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are talking about Agrippina the Elder and the Younger. Agrippina the Elder is the daughter of Julia, who's the daughter of Augustus and Livia, so she is the granddaughter of Augustus, who is the first ever Roman emperor, so she's got a strong lineage. She then marries Germanicus, and she goes out on campaign with him a lot, helping to manage things like the soldiers' safety. She's a good wife to him, although some sources describe her as arrogant, but that's a common word used by those male ancient historians when describing a woman who has an ounce of power. So you decide whether you believe that or not. Emperor Tiberius makes Germanicus his heir, so Germanicus is next in line to be emperor, but he dies in the year 19. So Agrippina starts to begin the campaigns for her 2 sons to succeed him, because they're direct descendants of Augustus anyway, and Germanicus was Tiberius's heir. Tiberius's sons are dead, so naturally it should fall to them anyway. And in the year 23, they are starting to gather support. It's going relatively well, but then the leader of the Praetorian Guard decides that he should be emperor, so they start to fight for Emperor Tiberius's attention. Now, because her opposition is the leader of the Praetorian Guard, he gets the Praetorian Guard to start arresting any of her supporters on charges of treason, a charge that eventually finds Agrippina herself. But because politics is going a bit mad at this point, the Emperor Tiberius decides to finally step in, and the leader of the Praetorian Guard is executed, and Agrippina and 2 of her sons, the 2 that she's campaigning for, are exiled. Now, one of her sons, Caligula, manages to escape and hide with his grandma Livia, and the 3 daughters, they escape exile as well. They're all fine. Whilst on this island, her 2 sons are encouraged to themselves, and Agrippina is constantly beaten, apparently to the point where her eye was torn out, and then she is starved to death. A pretty strong and feisty woman, I would like to believe. Now, one of her 3 daughters was Agrippina the Younger, who is possibly the most influential woman of the early Roman Empire. She is central and integral to the first family of the Roman emperors, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She's the great-granddaughter of the first Emperor Augustus. She is the daughter of the military leader and the beloved Germanicus. She is the sister of the Emperor Caligula. She is the niece and wife of the Emperor Claudius and the mother of Emperor Nero. She's so key to this family. Things do go well at the beginning of her brother Caligula's reign, but when one of their sisters died and his madness starts to kick in, she is exiled because he thinks that she's part of a plot to kill him. She wasn't. She's exiled until Caligula is assassinated and Claudius is declared emperor. Claudius likes his niece, brings her back and marries her, a marriage that was disproved at the time. People didn't like it because it is incest, but apparently the laws against it are quite easily overturned when you are emperor. She then becomes known for her very domineering personality, and she is the power behind Claudius's very otherwise weak rule. She's active in Senate meetings when women weren't even supposed to be allowed in the room. She appoints Praetorian guards, she has statues built after her, she names a colony after herself, and she signs imperial documents. Claudius's son dies and her son Nero is put in line for succession, and then Claudius himself suspiciously dies from poisoning. Of course, it's thought she did it because she then grabs that power for her son Nero, and because he's relatively young, she is ruling regent over his reign, so she still is the power behind the decisions on state decisions and imperial policy. But Nero eventually has enough of her domineering personality. He wants the power for himself now he's old enough, so he takes away her titles, her power, sends her off into Rome with no guards, and then tries to assassinate her, but it does take a fair few attempts to do so. Agrippina the Elder is an important woman in the Julio-Claudian family or dynasty. She is Augustus's direct granddaughter through her mother, and her cousin Germanicus is named Tiberius's heir after her brothers die. She marries Germanicus and they're quite happy. She stays with him on campaigns and helps to manage things, including the safety of soldiers. Their children are also always present in camp, the most popular and famous being Gaius, who loved to dress in his own mini uniform, earning him the name Caligula, meaning little boots. She was a good wife, but sources describe her as arrogant, but that's a common descriptor used by ancient authors describing any woman who has any ounce of power, so, I think I said that in the short as well. But this is where her story starts to go downhill. She's happily married to the heir to the empire, but the emperor is basically jealous of her husband's popularity and realises he doesn't actually want him to take over from him. So Germanicus dies, and it's argued that he is killed by the Emperor Tiberius in 19 AD, leaving her with their 6 children. But the death of Germanicus and Tiberius's jealousy and poor shoddy reign is a discussion for another time, I think. Like I said, she decides to start to prepare the campaigns for her son's succession through her. They're direct descendants of Augustus, the first ever Roman emperor. They're the sons of Germanicus, who Tiberius had chosen as heir to the empire anyway, and Tiberius's sons have died. So it's looking good for her and her sons, but then in the year 23, when they finally start gathering lots of support, the head of the Praetorian Guard also decides to campaign for succession, and they have to fight for the emperor's attention. So Tiberius retreats, as usual, to the Isle of Capri, which doesn't help the politics settle down at all, because he's a big fat chicken. Agrippina refuses to eat anything she doesn't see being prepared for fear of poison, and she requests permission from Tiberius to remarry. Since the emperor isn't helping her, she needs another man to secure her future and her children's, but she's denied. Then the Praetorian Guard starts to arrest her supporters on charges of treason, which is a charge that eventually gets Agrippina herself. But at this point, Livia, her grandmother, supports her, so she is just placed on house arrest. But when Livia dies, she is stuck with no help, so Tiberius has to come back into the picture because the state won't act without the emperor's approval. Sejanus, the leader of the Praetorian Guard, is executed, and Agrippina is exiled to our favourite exile island of the era, Pondicherry. Her 2 sons are also exiled on made-up charges, with Caligula escaping to hide with his grandmother Julia. She's regularly beaten, apparently to the point where her eye is torn out, and her 2 sons are encouraged to commit suicide, and she is starved to death. Eventually, they are given a proper burial when her son Caligula becomes emperor, but it's a rough end for a woman whose story started out quite nicely. So she had 3 sons and 3 daughters, one of whom was Agrippina the Younger, who is one of the most influential women of the dynasty. Just to clarify how central she is, because at this moment I can't remember what I said in the short. She's the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the wife and niece of Claudius, and the mother of Nero. That's 4 emperors and a very important military figure in Roman history that she is very important too. During her brother Caligula's early reign, her and her sisters Livia and Drusilla are treated with great honour, and they even appear on coins. The turning point was Drusilla's death. Not only is the death of his sister thought to be the start of Caligula's madness, but it's also at this point when Agrippina, Livia and Drusilla's husbands, are all involved in a supposed assassination attempt of Caligula, meaning they are banished. Then, when Claudius is declared emperor after the assassination of Caligula, she returns to Rome, where they are put together. But the marriage was a scandal, as it was incest, so actually against the law, but apparently those laws are quite easily turned over when you're the emperor, as I think I said in the short. And the Senate eventually approved the union of uncle and niece. So she's now the wife of an emperor as well. She's known for her domineering personality, especially over Claudius's weak rule. She was the true power behind his rule, being active in Senate meetings where women weren't even allowed at the time. She signed imperial documents, had a colony named after herself, built statues for herself, and she even appointed officers of the Praetorian Guard. When Claudius dies, it's said she poisoned him, even though his health was never that good anyway, so he could have just died. But she very quickly takes control of everything, so it's very suspicious, considering she's also always pushed for the power of her son Nero, and Claudius's other son has died, and she's always been quite dominant over the rule of Rome anyway. She then acts as regent over her son Nero's early reign, as he was relatively young when Claudius died. So she still held the power over state decisions and imperial policy for a while after her husband's death. She also receives the same honours, the same as Livia, being a wife and a mother of different emperors. But Nero starts to have enough of her when she disapproves of his new love, and he starts realising that he wants to take rule for himself. He wants to be alone in the power. So he takes her titles and removes her from court, sending her home with no guards. Despite this, though, most of Rome's nobility still refer to her as the administrator of the city at the time. But then there's a fair few attempts at assassination of her before Nero is finally successful and kills her. So even at the end of her reign, rule, power, she's still pretty powerful and strong, avoiding being killed. And I feel like you all know what I'm going to say. I did a full episode on Roman women, so there's lots more details in that episode. Let's take a huge leap forward in time now. It's day 8 of 30 We call her the mother of Wi-Fi, and she's made her way into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So, should we focus on her discoveries or on Hollywood? We'll do a little bit of Hollywood, I suppose, as it is important, but we are here for her scientific mind. Hedy studied acting in Berlin with Max Reinhardt, who gave her her first film role in 1930, and after her big break with Ecstasy, she grew a fan base, one of whom was Fritz Mandl, who she would marry in 1933, which was luckily a short-lived marriage. In her own words, "I knew very soon that I could never be an actress while I was his wife. He was the absolute monarch in the marriage. I was like a doll. I was like a thing, some object of art which had to be guarded and imprisoned, having no mind, no life of its own." It's also incredible how lucky she was at that time, being born into a Jewish family, with her actual name being Hedwig Eva Keisler, born in Austria and moving to Berlin and marrying a man associated with Nazis. It's incredible she got through that to flee to London in 1937. Which is when we meet Howard Hughes. He wanted to create faster planes to sell to the US military, and because of her interest, she worked with him. She combined ideas of fish and birds and the way they looked to design new planes that he deemed her a genius for. Then she met George Antheil, who said, "Hedy said that she did not feel very comfortable sitting there in Hollywood and making lots of money when things were in such a state." So she wanted to help, and using the knowledge of munitions and weaponry from the first husband, the pair began to develop ideas that would combat the Axis powers. No, I'm not sure what that is, but they came up with a new communication system to guide torpedoes to targets, so it must be something to do with that. The new system prevented the interception of radio waves, so they sought a patent and military support for their invention, but the Navy decided against using their new system. So Hedy became an American citizen officially and decided to help the war instead by selling war bonds. She continued to work in films while her innovative genius was ignored by the public. Until her later years, her and George were awarded the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award in 1997. She was the first woman to receive the Invention Convention's Bowlby-Nass Spirit of Achievement Award, and after dying in the year 2000, she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame and was dubbed the Mother of Wi-Fi. One very smart and brave woman from history. And now we go on to another pirate. It's day 9 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are learning about, bear with, Sayyida Al Hurra. Let's find out. Sayyida came from a family of Muslim nobles living in Granada in Spain when in 1492 they were forced to flee to Morocco because the Spanish nobility didn't want Muslims in their country. Sayyida never forgave or forgot this injustice and used it to make her strong and powerful. When she was 16, she married the Sultan of Tetuan, and they were under threat of attack from Spain and Portugal. Now, queens didn't usually have any power, didn't have any say in military matters, but because it was an old enemy, she decided to fight back. When her husband died, she stays queen and she keeps power, and she's determined to get rid of those nasty Spaniards, so she enlists the help of some pirates. So she became allies with one of the most fearsome pirates of the time, Barbarossa of Algiers, and they ruled the entire Mediterranean Sea. They plundered the Spanish and Portuguese ships, and they kept people for ransom. She was so powerful that she then made the Moroccan Sultan come over to Tetuan to marry her. She didn't go to him. She went on to rule as the pirate queen for 30 years, and she rebuilt her city so that intruders could never invade. Now, I really enjoy a pirate story, a bit of pirate history, so much so that I've already done a full video on female pirates. Just have a little scroll through my YouTube. Sorry, there's so many plugs in this episode, I'm very sorry. Next week, I don't think I've spoken about much of the women, so don't worry, I won't be promoting everything else to you. So, Sayyida Al Hurra. Other sources call her Sayyida Al Hurra, so if you read about that name too, it's, I believe, the same person, but of course, the confusion over a name already makes it tricky finding out her story, as well as the usual fact that men writing history tend to forget to mention a woman of power entirely, or they write her horribly, and the ruler after her tried to erase her from history. The more detailed sources we do have of her are from the Spanish and Portuguese writers, so she's presented as a very aggressive pirate. So as usual, we'll be careful with our sources. We don't actually know her real name, as it's been translated so many times, and what we call her now was likely a title anyway. There's a book by Fatima Manissi called The Forgotten Queens of Islam, and she says it translates to something like, the noble woman who is free and independent, the woman sovereign who bows to no superior authority. This, along with all other translations I could find, leads to one thing for certain: she was a powerful female leader under her own authority. She didn't answer to anyone. There's a lot of invasion history of Morocco in the 15th and 16th century, but the important part for this story comes when Castile destroy Tetuan, a very important seaport and naval base for northern Morocco. In 1399 into 1400, it's rebuilt again, but destroyed again, this time in 1437 by Portuguese armies, and it then remains in ruins until 1485, when a Grenadian captain was put in charge to govern it, and so families like Sayyida's were forced to flee to North Africa. Her father was one of the people that then sent tribesmen back over to help Al-Mandri, who was the captain governing, to help restore Tetuan, and he does. He manages to restore it. If I've got any of that wrong, I do apologise. I was a bit confused reading it. But anyway, our story's focus on Sayyida and her noble family. They've had to flee to North Africa, and it's thought she had memories of the family's exile, or she learnt from the adults around her, and of course she resents the exile and never forgives. It's thought she married the son or nephew of Al-Mandri, who saved Tetuan, and that brings the family to even more political heights, and it gets her more information on the invading Spanish on Morocco. After her marriage, she became the co-regent of Tetuan alongside her husband, with a lot of trust being placed on her, something that was apparently common in Morocco. Women were actually trusted. She even completely ruled the city when her husband went away, and she became the sole ruler when he died, and there was no opposition to a woman taking that kind of power. This was when she would have assumed the title Sayyida Al Hurra, and Tetuan flourished. Most of Tetuan's prosperity, however, came from her attacks of enemy ships and raiding settlements, which is why, as well as being ruler of the city, she was the leader of pirates in the Western Mediterranean, which makes sense, as at the time Morocco had no fleet of ships, as Spain and Portugal had taken all the major ports, so she had to rely on pirates to attack. So she made her own sort of fleet of privateers and pirates. Fair play, you've got to fight back somehow. It's said that she had contacts with the brothers Barbarossa, the famous privateer brothers, the most notorious of the Barbary Corsairs, which was a group of Muslim pirates operating from Algiers. It's said that learning from the brothers, Sayyida then became a privateer herself, attacking ships and towns and assembling her own fleet. It's said that she was a strong leader in charge of her fleets and armies, although it is questioned if she actually ever boarded a ship, but she coordinated war efforts, and the captains on the ships respected her authority and took her orders. And because of her many naval activities, she has become the pirate queen by European sources who were her enemy. But of course, this is the era of pirates where everyone is doing the same thing, raiding other countries and taking their plunder. When they do it, it's fine, but when it's the enemy, it's piracy. And that can be seen in every source, Christian or Muslim, European or Arabic. From her people's perspective, though, she defended them well and avenged her people, letting her city flourish. And with that, let's move on to our last woman of the week. It's day 10 of 31 Days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are learning about Jean McNamara, 1899 to 1968. In order to be a good sexist, you need to be able to do some impressive mental gymnastics to find reasons why women cannot and should not do things. One great example of this, in history, was the excuse used for years as to why women couldn't be doctors in Melbourne at the start of the 20th century. Was it that they might swoon at the sight of blood? Was it that their periods would get all over the hospital floors and make everything horribly slippy? No. The reason given to Jean McNamara in 1923 at Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital as to why they couldn't possibly employ her, a woman, was this. "Soz babe, there aren't any girls' toilets." Well, not in that exact language. Or maybe in that language exactly. After all, we are talking about idiots. So, born in 1899, she worked ridiculously hard and became a very trusted doctor, mostly by families who would wait as long as it took to be able to see her. She specialised in orthopaedics, which meant she developed new ways to splint different parts of the body. And she advocated for new ways for caring for disabled people, especially children. She was eventually allowed to work at that hospital we mentioned earlier, which is a good thing because she discovered that polio had different strains, which led to the vaccination that would come in the future. And she was then invited to the White House by President Roosevelt, who had been paralysed by polio. There was also this huge rabbit population in Australia at the time, and she pushed for them to use the disease that killed them, which isn't great if you like animals, but if you don't want us to be overrun by rabbits, I suppose she's great. And this ends by saying thank women scientists, and we should thank women scientists because now we don't worry about polio. And also thank you, Hannah Jewell, for teaching me about someone new. So Jean McNamara studies in Melbourne in 1922, and in 1923 she became the resident medical officer at the Royal Children's Hospital, despite those initial refusals from the idiot authorities who thought that no toilets was a good enough excuse to stop her joining. She began to research polio and its treatments and was awarded a scholarship so that she could travel and study in America, Canada and England. Whilst in England at the Shropshire Orthopaedic Hospital, she seemed to enjoy the study of orthopaedics. Whilst in America, she taught about the necessary aftercare for disabled people, met the president and developed new ideas for splinting and rehabilitation. She worked alongside Fran McFarland Burnett, who identified the multiple strains of polio. So they created the pivotal moment in the development of the vaccine, and they're recognised for that research. She was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire for her work with children in 1935, as she had become renowned for her orthopaedic work, working on her own premises at Spring Street, working constantly and sometimes not taking a fee. By 1938, she had established a clinic that treated 30 children a day with physiotherapists. The children were driven there and back by volunteer chauffeurs and were given a hot lunch. In the 1930s, she also campaigns for the use of the myxoma virus to be used on the expanding rabbit population, and by the 50s, rabbits had stopped popping up at an alarming rate, which is apparently a good thing as there were just so many rabbits they were ruining farming and things like soil, and Australia were going to be overrun by rabbits. In 1966, she was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate of laws by Melbourne University. So she's an important pioneering doctor and scientist. There is so much more to her story, and I've put a link in the description of this episode to a website that tells you all about her, as she did so much amazing work at each hospital she was in. But we do have to come to an end of this episode, I'm afraid. So that concludes week 2 of Women's History Month. Thank you so much for watching or listening. I do hope you've enjoyed. If you did and you're watching, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening, please do follow the podcast and give it as many stars as you think it deserves. Hopefully 5, you never know. Thanks again. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.